Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be looking at mostly domestic policy and domestic issues throughout the 1990s, from the first Bush administration, that's George H.W. Bush, a little bit on the Clinton years, and then seeing the election of George W. Bush, which then places us into our very own century, into the 21st century, actually, getting closer and closer to modern times. And once again, dealing with a lot of issues and a lot of events that it really kind of depends on people's politics as to how they see, how they interpret these particular events, how they feel about them. So, as we get closer and closer to things that truly are current events, that becomes something that we should definitely keep in mind. In that, in many respects, in many regards, the full implications, the full legacy of some of these events are yet to be seen. So, we're going to begin looking at the presidency of George H.W. Bush. We looked at his foreign policy and the big foreign issues in the previous section, but now we're going to look at the home front. This does say home front right here, that's covered up by the picture there. And of course, Bush kind of presides over sort of an awkward time in some ways as the United States comes of out of the Cold War, but really kind of unsure, of where that was going to go and what the next steps were. And so Bush is rather cautious about that. You don't want to just suddenly celebrate final victory in the Cold War, particularly as conflicts continued to breed themselves and things like that in Europe. And domestically, Bush does not really have too much of a really specific agenda. Most of the Bush presidency is dominated by some of those foreign policy issues, like the collapse of the Soviet Union and, of course, the Persian Gulf War. But to point out just a couple of high points of things that did occur under the Bush administration, again, Bush, during this time, we really don't have too much of a really specific domestic policy measures, but some things that we can mention that were extremely important and have an impact on our society today include the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is passed in the early 1990s, or ADA, as you may have heard it called. We've looked before at various groups that were inspired by the African American civil rights movement that then took it upon themselves to seek for greater rights for themselves, whether that was women or Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans. We saw the beginnings of the gay rights movement, of, Chicano movement, various things. And another movement that comes along with that is the disabilities movement. And this is partially inspired by the African American civil rights movement and others, and it may also be partially related, another, long-term consequence of involvement in Vietnam. It's certainly not the only thing, but that had left many Americans, many returning soldiers disabled. And so the disabilities movement really starts to gain steam in the 1980s and result in national federal legislation, the with Disabilities Act, in the early 1990s. And, Americans with disabilities, both physical disabilities and mental disabilities, wanted the same rights as everyone else. They wanted to be able to use public facilities. They wanted to end discrimination in hiring, in education, all of those sorts of things, which is where we get, or why we get, ADA. And you can see some of these really, really powerful, when you think about it, such moving images of these people down here towards the bottom, people with mobility disabilities dragging themselves up the stairs of Congress to say it isn't right that we cannot easily, approach the halls of Congress, that these things, these basic democratic principles, these basic democratic institutions are not accessible to us. That, and particularly in the case of veterans, to say I fought and for my country, and yet I can't get onto a bus without help. I can't go into a store. I can't do this, that, or the other because of those physical disabilities. So with the Americans with Disabilities Act, this put all kinds of things, but the main thing that you probably think of is standards as far as providing accessibility for maybe people who use a wheelchair. This is why there have to be wheelchair ramps going into, in a parking lot, why there have to be elevators or wheelchair ramps inside buildings. There have to be ways for people that have physical disabilities or what have you to be accommodated. But it also includes, non-discrimination in hiring. So it would be illegal to, say, not hire someone with a disability if that is truly the only reason. If you've got two, candidates that otherwise match, you can't use someone's disability or ability to discriminate in hiring. So a big move, a big day, although of course many disability advocates would argue there's still a long way to go, but still a big day for individuals with disabilities. And then we'll see even more laws passed later on that particularly pertain to some more specific things such as education. Now, again, for Bush, there's really not, his political future is really kind of based on his foreign policy. There's not a whole lot of domestic programs. And in fact, there's really kind of a lot of domestic problems. One of the things, though, that Bush had really relied on in his election campaign in 1988 was the promise to not raise taxes. This phrase right here, read my lips, no new taxes, was a catchphrase that he used throughout the campaign that he said over and over and over again to say exactly what it suggests, to say, whatever happens, I will not raise taxes, and that, of course, was a big, um, hallmark of the Reagan conservative revolution of tax cuts, and we're going to start spending less and all those kind of things. However, for Bush, this probably helps propel him to the White House, but it ends up being a promise that he is unable to keep with various issues, one of them being the Persian Gulf War, but certainly not the only one. Bush eventually did have to raise taxes in a couple of places, and so that really, really, really did not give him any kind of momentum and really cost him a good bit of popularity. So when he makes this promise and makes this big thing about not raising taxes and then has to do so anyway, that costs him a great deal of popularity, a lot of approval, a lot of support, and some would even argue it costs him a second term. That's one of the big reasons why Bush is not reelected to a second term of office. So we're going to look now at that election where Bush is defeated and does not win a second term of office. That is the 1992 election. So Bush is running for reelection in 1992. Again, the whole "read my lips, no new taxes" thing that didn't work out cost him a lot of support. But also in the election of 1992, Bush kind of comes across as being sort of the elder statesman, of being sort of tired and worn out and kind of the old guard and out of touch perhaps with younger Americans that didn't quite understand some of the newer issues that many Americans were concerned about. And a lot of Americans' attention was captured, and the election, as you may know, eventually won by a more youthful candidate, a newer candidate, and someone that really tried to portray themselves as a different kind of candidate. And that is Bill Clinton, who ran against Bush as the Democrat in 1992. Bill Clinton, again, quite youthful at the time. He was governor of Arkansas. At the time, he became the first president of that baby boomer generation that was born after World War II, which again to us does not sound very young, but in 1992 that was a big deal. And he very much used that youthfulness and that connection, that ability to connect or attempt to connect with younger Americans, with a younger generation that had different concerns, to appear kind of cool. I can distinctly remember it being such a big thing of Bill Clinton when he was a candidate, going on late night talk shows, and it became a big cultural phenomenon when he played the saxophone wearing sunglasses and all these kind of sort of kitschy things, but things that made him appealing and made him look young and vibrant and all this kind of stuff. Bill Clinton is a Democrat, still living, so he is a Democrat, and portrays himself as a new Democrat. That's kind of the phrase that he uses throughout his campaign, and tries to call himself a new Democrat. In other words, and that's kind of similar to what Carter had tried to do back in the 70s, was to try to distance himself from the sort of more traditional Democratic Party, specifically to distance himself from the liberalism of the New Deal and the Great Society, to say, yes, I'm a Democrat. I support social services. I support welfare. I support these kinds of welfare programs, the safety net, and all those kinds of things. But I'm not about just spin, spin, spin. The image certainly that had gotten to a lot of people's minds since the Reagan era was that Democrats were just spending, 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 and that their answer to everything was just throw money at it. And you ended up with waste and deficits and all kinds of problems. So Clinton tries to say, I'm not like that. And that he yeah, doesn't want to get rid of things like Social Security, but he's not about expanding that kind of stuff. That he's not only about social welfare. He's not only about helping people in poverty and things like that. That he is focused on jobs. He's focused on education. He's focused on healthcare, and things that are going to eventually help people, kind of similar to the war of poverty, I guess, kind of have a better economic future, not by government programs and throwing money at stuff, but to create jobs, to create a just more vibrant economy, and to really focus more on economic issues and away from social and cultural issues. So it's also an attempt to distance themselves from the counterculture and some of those things that had caused very much a backlash by the 1980s. And the results of the election, we did have, it was a little bit on the close side. You also had, if you're wondering who this fella is right here in the center, this is Ross Perot. Ross Perot was a businessman from Texas and ran as an independent. And usually you don't see independent candidates that are neither endorsed by the Republicans or the Democrats doing incredibly well. But Perot actually did pretty well, made a pretty strong showing, given he was an independent candidate. But the result, of course, Clinton won the election. And so Democrats retake the White House for the first time since Jimmy Carter. So now we're going to take a look at some of the domestic programs, some of the successes and the failures of the Clinton era. And here, Clinton has rather mixed results. There are a lot of firsts here. Again, I mentioned Clinton being the first baby boomer president. We start to see a great deal more diversity in the federal government by this point. Clinton probably appoints at that time, or what was at that time, the most diverse cabinet with the most women, the most Hispanic Americans, African Americans serving in high government positions than you'd ever had before. So we're beginning to see more inclusion, and part of that's a reflection of the changes taking place demographically, in America overall. But we are also seeing or some of the things that I think kind of mark the Clinton era, which is most of the 1990s all the way up to 2000, is really strong economy. We enter a period of really strong economic growth due to technology and the beginnings of the internet and the whole .com explosion and all those kind of things, which were very, very successful in the United States, and that did, offered a lot of high paying jobs. So we did see a big economic expansion, one of the biggest economic expansions that there had been, in several decades. But we're also beginning to see more and more divided government. We're entering an era of more very bitterly divided government, something that probably looks quite familiar to us, but seeing Congress being, really narrowly divided between Republicans and Democrats, where it's, just a razor thin margin that the Republicans might have or the Democrats might have, give or take, whenever you're talking about, and things becoming much more divided, much more bitter, much more contentious. And that's due to a number of things. And of course, we continue to see that happening. Some of the big things that take place, or rather that don't take place, that are not successful under the Clinton years, one of the big goals in the Clinton administration was to reform the healthcare system. And this may ring a bell for many of you because you may remember hearing all of this, and we saw it kind of come back again under the Obama administration in the mid 2000s. But healthcare reform was something that had been on the minds of Democrats for quite some time. And Clinton had some very, very lofty goals of trying to make healthcare more affordable, more available, recognizing that this was a growing cost and something that not all Americans had access to. So, as far as the specific reforms that he was proposing, I'm not going to go over all those specific things. Just overall, the goal was to broaden healthcare to make it easier, affordable, and give more Americans access to it. But this also ends up being one of the biggest failures of the Clinton administration. The healthcare reform bill that he proposed was very, very complicated, and it was not popular from the beginning. He immediately got huge amounts of pushback from Republicans, huge amounts of pushback from insurance companies, from all sorts of places. And we saw the same thing happen in the Obama administration. He was more successful with it, but the same kind of just vicious backlash. And so it ended up being something that never got through Congress. It really kind of never even had a chance because it was just so unpopular from the get-go. People were so against it. So that was not a success for Clinton. Some things that you could list as accomplishments for the Clinton administration: we did get the Family Medical Leave Act, or some of you may have heard of this by its abbreviation, FMLA. The Family Medical Leave Act is the law that allows individuals to take sick leave, maternity leave, paternity leave from their job. Say if you are a long illness, birth of a child, surgery, something like that, where you need basically what this offers is 12 weeks of unpaid leave. So basically saying that employers can't fire somebody if you're going to have surgery and going to be out for a month, that they can't fire you for that, that you have to be promised your job back. Now it is unpaid leave, it doesn't mean they have to pay you, but that you couldn't lose your job for those kind of things. So they're try to provide more job security, economic security when people come on those hard times, or maybe even if they're caring for someone, you could invoke FMLA. Maybe if you've got a parent that's ill and you're caring for them for a short period of time. So it promises that that employment won't lapse and medical coverage won't lapse and things like that. So to try to provide more of a safety net in that sense. There's also some significant welfare reforms that are done in the 1990s. Typically, we think about Democrats wanting to expand the welfare state, wanting to expand welfare benefits, and wanting to make more of those things. But in the Clinton administration, you actually saw cuts to welfare, or rather restructuring to welfare. Some of the welfare reforms that were done in the 1990s put more limits on the amount of time that a person could receive welfare, to try to encourage people to get back in the workforce and to try to make welfare payments and benefits more temporary kind of things. It also put more emphasis on searching for jobs and job skills and people having to prove that they were, looking for employment and things like that. So there were some numerous welfare reforms that were moderately successful. People still today argue about the merits of those and if they um, did anything. But the goal of a lot of those for Clinton was to not so much expand the welfare state, but was to try to reform it so that welfare would become something that people wouldn't be on forever, to try to provide opportunities or encouragement for people to want to get off of welfare benefits and payments. Another important development that again becomes quite divisive even today as to whether or not, an economists and experts would argue all the live long day about the merits of this, and it's got its downsides and its plus sides, which is just sort of the truth of everything, I suppose. And that is the passage of NAFTA, which stands for the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement. NAFTA, or the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, this is basically just what it sounds like. It is a free trade agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So, eliminating all trade barriers between those nations. So, essentially means we can trade with Mexico and several other Central American countries, or Canada, as if they were not foreign countries. So, it eliminates taxes and tariffs and things like that. So, almost like saying that imports from those places aren't imports. The benefit to that, and somewhat some might argue was a good thing, and the reason why Clinton supported it, is to increase trade with those countries. If you're bringing down the barriers, bringing down the walls, it means more trade, and that means lower prices. It means better access to a lot of goods, which a lot of people want. It means, cheap commodities. It means lower prices in the stores, people like that. The downside to that, the great criticism of NAFTA, is that this eventually costs a lot of American jobs, because this leads a lot of American businesses and manufacturers to move their facilities, move their plants to, say, Mexico, where they can pay workers a whole lot less and not have to pay, pensions and, disability payments and all these other kind of things. So, in order to cut their costs, they move their jobs somewhere else. And this has continued to happen throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. More and more manufacturing jobs going overseas, and not all of that is because of NAFTA, because not all of it is going to, say, Mexico. A lot of it's going to China and places like that. But NAFTA is certainly one of the reasons for that. So it is also sometimes blamed for the decline of manufacturing jobs and the closure of a lot of American manufacturing, and therefore loss of jobs, hurts to the middle class, things like that. So, again, depends on where people stand on some of those issues as to whether or not that was a good thing or a bad thing. And of course, one of the big things that Clinton is known for, one of the scars on his legacy, or some don't look at it as a scar on on his legacy. Some would look at this as maybe one of his greatest accomplishments, or maybe nothing at all. Clinton, of course, becomes the second president to actually be impeached, not counting Nixon. Of course, we're remembering that Nixon resigned before his impeachment could take place. But Clinton ends up going through an entire impeachment scandal. The impeachment actually taking place in December of 1998, meaning that is when Congress voted for the articles of impeachment. Now, I want to the specific details about what Clinton was impeached for and the crimes and all of that. While they are, you know, maybe not the most important thing, in a way they are, I think, because I find that it's greatly misunderstood. A lot of folks just misunderstand what Clinton was impeached for, what the crimes were, and all of that. The most common thing I hear a lot is that Clinton is impeached for having an affair, which is wrong. Because if you think about it, impeachment, that is accusing the president of a crime, having an affair. While many might consider that immoral, wrong on many levels, it's not illegal. It's not against the law, just having an affair. This whole thing breaks, at the story being that President Clinton had had an affair with a White House intern, Monica Lewinsky. The issue came up, or the accusations of wrongdoing, the accusations of committing a crime, came in when Clinton was questioned about this and they were investigating it. He was accused and then eventually charged with lying about it. It's not the having an affair, it's the lying, that he lied to Congress when he was questioned under oath about this affair. So he's officially charged with obstruction of justice and perjury. Perjury meaning, lying under oath. And, this again is still really divisive because Clinton did literally, I remember watching it, it was my 16th birthday, did a address to the nation where he looked right in the camera and almost pointed in the camera and said, I promise you that I did not have, his words, I did not have relations with that woman, or I did not have sexual relations with that woman. And then months later comes back on TV and admits that in fact that he did. The truth is he did have an affair. There was an affair between the two of them. But in the end, before I get ahead of myself, the results of the impeachment trial is, he was impeached, which just means that the charges were filed. And then after a lengthy trial in the Senate and lots of questions and lots of information and lots of really disgusting stuff that we did not want to know about, we all found out it was very much a TMI situation. Clinton was acquitted of those charges. The general assumption, or the general feeling, um, for most congressmen voting to acquit the president of those charges, was that while there may have been wrongdoing here, it was not an impeachable offense. That this did not amount to a high crime or a misdemeanor. That a president not being entirely truthful or being rather selective about what he says about an illicit affair that he had in the White House is maybe not quite the same thing as lying about, something related to, I don't know, national defense, or you name it. The other and defense and the defense of President Clinton, and this is ultimately the defense that held up, was, I didn't lie, you just didn't ask the right question. And this is again where it got really technical and really kind of gross and stuff that people really kind of didn't want to know, because the question was, were there sexual relations? Well, that means different things to different people. Is exactly what does that mean? So, that was Clinton's defense, was that, didn't lie, you just didn't quite ask the right thing. So there you have it. So in the end, Clinton is found not guilty of those charges. And in fact, interestingly enough, you would think this would at least make him unpopular. And it really didn't. The fact that the economy was so, dare I say, awesome in 1990, in the late 90s, things were going so well. The strong economy probably helped get Clinton through this without too much of a scar. He remained actually very, very popular even throughout it. And in fact, Republicans are the ones that suffered. In this 1998 was also a midterm election year, not a presidential election year, but when part of Congress is being elected, and the Republicans actually lost seats in Congress, which is highly unusual. Usually, the party in power, the Democrats in this case, will lose seats at the midterms. That's usually expected, but in this case, the Democrats won seats, even though they were the ones in power and had a president that was undergoing impeachment proceedings. So that was, just kind of a reflection on maybe how some people felt about the impeachment and how confident people were in Clinton's leadership with the economy being as strong as it was. So that brings us to the turn of the century, finally moving into some numbers we more recognize, looking into the end of the 1990s and into the 21st century with the crazy election of 2000. So, in the election of 2000, as some of you may well know, we saw a very tight, very, very close, the closest election that, and I would say the craziest election. I think it's probably been surpassed now by perhaps 2020. That might be safe to say, but a very, very close, very contentious, very nasty election between Al Gore running as the Democrat. He had been Clinton's vice president, kind of the heir apparent, against George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush, as the Republican. And George W. Bush, of course, at the time, the governor of Texas. And of course, the unusual thing about the election of 2000 is that. There it was all came down to the state of Florida. This was very, very close. Came down to the state of Florida, and in the state of Florida, the vote was so close that according to Florida law, they had to recount it. That there a recount was ordered by their law. And in fact, originally, we all went to bed that night thinking that Bush had won. Bush had really been declared the winner. Gore had even conceded. Congratulations, Mr. Bush, all of this. And then Florida comes back and says, actually, it's too close to call. We got to go back and recount it. And Gore actually called Bush back and recanted on his concession, which was a highly unusual thing as well. And so then we waited for weeks and weeks and weeks while Florida counted and counted and counted. And there were all kinds of irregularities and there were all kinds of problems and there were all kinds of accusations of crazy things. This picture right here showed they had a lot of the ballots in some of the counties with these little punch card things, and they were very prone to errors. And there were places where you can look up pictures of some of these where it really is quite hard to tell what exactly you're punching for. And so there were concerns about, did people misdo these or were they read correctly? And it just went on and on and on. And every time they would count some of these from certain counties, they would get different numbers. And it kind of just kept going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. This eventually wound up in the Supreme Court. And I think it's important to clarify exactly what this case was about and exactly what the ruling was in Bush versus Gore. There's a great misconception that I heard a lot during the 2020 campaign or 2020 election that Bush versus Gore was the Supreme Court giving the election to George W. Bush. That is not the case. This was not the court deciding who the winner of the election was. The issue here was about the recount and basically, or charging that the recount violated people's constitutional rights because they were recounting some ballots but not all of the ballots. And so the legal reasoning for this was that that violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, that you can't count these and not those, you can't redo these and not those, so forth and so on. So the ruling in Bush versus Gore was not Bush is the winner. It was Florida's got to stop the recount. You've got to stop recounting and declare the winner, and that's the end of it. And so that's what happened. So with Bush versus Gore, very, very narrow. I think it was by just one vote. They ruled that the recount had to stop, and that made Bush the winner. And Gore eventually conceded to Bush. And that will bring us to the 21st century. And of course, when we get to that, we will start to see things very much change, and we will see the world really be shaped more like the world that we know, particularly with the events of September 11th. So that is where we will be next time.